East, and thank you for joining our panel. As you're likely aware, the panel topic is procurement, the procurement toolkit, traditional P3 and progressive models, choosing the right tool for the right job. Really excited about this panel. It's a topic that I think we've been hearing a lot about, progressive models. My name is Terry Burgis. I'm a Senior Vice President with Kiewit Development, and I'm the head of P3 within the Kiewit Development Group. Kiewit Development is the development investment arm of Kiewit. We work across all sectors in which Kiewit constructs, operates, and we work as an integrated team with dedicated staff across North America. We support the development of Kiewit's project finance, alternative, and P3 projects from origination through procurement, construction, and operations, all the way through handback. I'm going to be moderating this panel today, if you hadn't guessed that already. And I'm joined by three very special guests and panelists, including Laurie Mahon from CIBC, Kate Borg from WSP, and David Hubner from Infrastructure BC. I'll just hand it over to Laurie, and Laurie, Kate, and David, you guys can introduce yourselves in that order.
Great. Thank you very much, Terry. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Laurie Mahon. I'm at CIBC as Vice Chair of our U.S. investment banking business, but I've been in the infrastructure world for more years than I care to tell you. But I will tell you that I did my first P3 in 1984 when I was Deputy CFO of New Jersey Transit, and we brought in a bunch of private investors to buy one of our train stations, rehab it, and let us operate in it. That P3 is actually still operating and is one of the longest running P3s that I'm aware of. I've also sat on the board of a construction company. I've been an advisor, I've been a developer, and I'm currently an investment banker. So I hope to share some of those perhaps competing perspectives with you today and along with my fellow panelists. Thank you very much, Terry, for inviting me.
Hello, everybody. My name is Kate Borg. I'm from WSP Canada. As you can probably tell, I come from WSP Australia. In Australia, we have a long history of collaborative contracting as well as P3. I'm currently the Vice President of P3 and Alliance Contracting with WSP in Canada. And at the moment, I am serving as the Alliance Design Manager for the USEP program here with Metrolinx in Toronto. Alliancing has been and collaborative contracting for that matter has been a big push in Australia for quite some time. We've been doing it for around 10 years, if not longer, particularly in the transport sector. I offer a lot of those insights into how the comparison is between P3 models and collaborative contracting, and I'm looking forward to a really good discussion today. I'm on the design team always, so that gives a little bit of context as to why I might have a bit more passion for collaborative contracting being in the design team. But again, very much looking forward to our discussion today. Terry, I think we've got a really great panel.
Hello, everybody. My name is David Hubner. I'm Vice President with Infrastructure BC, responsible for transportation and utilities. In my past life, I was involved in the banking sector and as well as corporate finance prior to getting into procurement with Infrastructure BC exclusively about 15 years ago, and have had the opportunity to work on numerous projects in numerous sectors, primarily in transportation. And I think I cut my teeth on the Port Mann Bridge project initially. And in the work that we've done here, we've done a fair number of P3 projects, as well as design build projects, and more recently have moved into progressive design build procurements, and we're also getting our toe into the Alliance pond on one project currently. So look forward to the discussion as well.
Thank you. As you can all see, we've got a great panel with a real broad spectrum of experience. So we'll draw on that through the conversation here. We thought in preparation for this would be helpful to set a little bit of background on what a progressive model is and progressive P3 is, because there are so many different interpretations of it, collaboration, progressive. So I think as many of you probably know, progressive or collaborative models have been used outside of North America for a number of years. Hence, Kate bringing that experience from Australia here, and we're seeing it being used extensively, or I guess starting to gain traction in the States in the water sector, and then more and more in progressive DB type models is where we've been seeing it. Now we're seeing it sort of move over into being used in P3s, US projects. Again, it seems to be the US leading on a lot of the adoption of progressive models. Projects like Sepulveda Pass, Pennsylvania Bridges, Lake Oswego, all progressive P3 models. But you're seeing it adopted by Canadian jurisdictions, as evidenced by Infrastructure Ontario recently rolling out how they plan to use the model. Infrastructure BC, as David's talking about, is looking at using the model on with design build finance, and they are doing it with design build already. So the model is evolving and it's being adopted more and more. And now we're seeing it being adopted from design build to P3. So just so we're all sort of starting off with what we talk about when we talk about a collaborative model, a progressive model, or iterative type model. It's a procurement approach that takes a more collaborative and iterative approach to developing a project, more so than what we see with traditional P3 or DB. So an RFQ phase that's very similar to what we're used to seeing, quals-based, shortlist to an RFP phase, and this is where the procurement starts to look different. It's typically a shorter RFP than normal, not like your 6 to 9 month P3 RFP. It's more an RFP to identify the best partner. So more quals based, trying to figure out who's the right partner to enter into some kind of pre-development or feed phase. And then entering into a feed phase, we're seeing it anywhere from one counterparty, one bidder at the feed phase, maybe two, sometimes three, enter into the execution of a development agreement, go through that development phase, and really collaboration between the private sector and the owner in terms of developing design, price, commercial structure, appropriate risk allocation, and then ending once you get to the point where you can fix the price with a financing solution and ending with the execution of a project agreement. So that's kind of the process. I mean, we've seen it applied in different ways in different jurisdictions, and I'm sure it's going to continue to evolve. But the one thing that, as a panel, when we were talking about it, we thought that the name progressive that's applied to all these models, because there's a number of them, shouldn't be taken to mean it's better than traditional models. It's just, call it an evolution of the model, and allows more collaboration between the private sectors and owners. So think of it as another procurement model to be used in the appropriate situation. So with that, I'm going to put some questions to our panelists, and the first question I have is really, what's driving this evolution to more collaborative models? I mean, we've seen this evolution, we're seeing it adopted, and maybe I'll just pose that first to David, and then we can go amongst the group. What's driving it for Infrastructure BC? Why the adoption of progressive models?
Yeah, thanks, Terry. So our experience with Infrastructure BC with what would be more typical P3 procurements or typical design bid or design build, it feels nice to be calling a P3 a typical procurement in this context. And I appreciate your comments around the terminology around progressive. I think with the projects that we've done, we've enjoyed a fairly high level of collaboration, through design build and P3s, collaboration being more around approaches to design solution, through a design competition with multiple firms working towards a fixed price proposal. And so the evolution towards progressive is really a result of essentially market forces and the number of responses that we were getting for RFQs on primarily social infrastructure and health. So this is a British Columbia situation where we had numerous projects out simultaneously. And, if the market has other opportunities outside of government, if it's with, condominium development or other things that we're competing against that. And so if there's less interest in the projects that we're putting out, our job is to get them procured and to get them built. So it's necessary to look for other ways to do it. So the progressive approach was the answer for several of the projects to set up a structure where essentially the province or the owner on those projects, really what it comes down to is taking back a bit more risk in the process and working towards entering into an agreement with one team in the case of the projects that we were working on, and then going through an iterative process to come up with a design where at the end of it, the team is able to provide a fixed price, I think with, what you'd consider to be less potential risk exposure than in a typical process because of the iterative nature. And at the end of the day, ending up with a design build contract. So it's really responding to the market. And that's been the evolution through the progressive procurements, as well as in the instance of the alliance procurement that's underway right now.
Okay. Laurie, I know you're spend a lot of time in the States and working on projects down there. You see something similar down there in terms of what's driving this evolution, or?
I do and I don't. It's I think part of the issue in the States is of course it's not one market. It's name it 120 markets between 50 states and territories and big cities and public agencies, each of which has their own procurement rules and regulations, some of which are very hidebound and kind of mired in 1950s engineering skills, and some of which are really open-minded and allow you to kind of do almost anything creatively. So I think we're seeing the challenge of finding a procurement methodology that balances the need of the public sector, which very often does not have state-of-the-art resources available to it, sadly, because of budget constraints over the last decades, and may not have the best and the brightest tools and modes and methods at their fingertips, balancing their need to have some control over a process with the desire to get the best of the private sector into the project. So it's not just about design, but it's also means and methods, and it's also phasing and even questions around what should we be building to solve the problem. So project definition is extremely important. Under a traditional procurement method, as practiced by most states, the government agency defines the problem and it scopes one solution, and that may or may not be the solution that the market would want to deliver. So when you see Sepulveda, for example, I think what you see there is a process that's taken almost 15 years, by the way. This is not quick, and it's had several iterations, but one where ultimately the market had a great deal to say to how Caltrans should be solving that transportation issue. So I think what we're going to see roll out in the States is in those jurisdictions that have a little more flexibility, both legally and professionally, this movement towards, call it pre-development agreement, call it progressive, give it whatever name you want, call it alliancing, I think will happen more quickly. Let's remember there's still states in the US that can't even do public-private partnerships. So I don't think we're going to see that there. So it is more of a mixed bag, but I think certainly for mega projects, which I'll define as those over $2 billion, it seems to be the direction that things are going in.
Yeah, right. Kate, did you see something similar in terms of the evolution of in Australia? Because I mean, obviously Australia's moved to this model kind of ahead of the North American market. So was it similar reasons that brought this out there? And you saw something?
Yeah, it really was, Terry. Both David and Laurie's answers very much resonate with the experience that I've seen myself down in Australia, of course. I think it's Australia is still learning, even though we've had a longer history than perhaps North America. We're still learning what the right models are for the right delivery and the right product that we're trying to get. I think I just came off a project that was Melbourne Metro, that was a P3. Prior to that, I'd worked on an alliance project. So you can see even now we still use both models quite successfully in Australia. One thing that both David and Laurie did touch on, which is very, very relevant, is about the risk share. And often the models that are best selected is best selected on the basis of how that risk is perceived, because that then will inform the scope. And what I've found through my experience is that those projects that have high risk and therefore ill-defined scope can be more suited to those collaborative contracts than potentially those projects that where the scope is quite narrow and very easily and readily definable. What we're seeing in Australia, even in Victoria, where I'm from, is as we get more and more towards doing mega projects, the packaging up of those projects actually could be a number of models. So it's not just about packaging up the delivery of the scope itself, but that scope is being delivered by different models. So there's a project that's being procured currently. It's still in its infancy, called Suburban Rail Link. That will be a combination of P3s and also alliance contracting or collaborative contracting, depending on what scope that we're adopting. So very much so. I think the advantage that North America has by looking at other world experiences is that you then have the flexibility to adapt and change after seeing those lessons learned. So there's a wonderful opportunity there for North America to really define those collaborative models and make them something really successful.
Right. And I mean, interesting point, and kind of hearing from all of you guys, it sort of sounds like the model is not for every project, but it's for certain types of projects, right? Like you said, it sounds like projects where maybe a bit of ambiguity on scope and challenging risks. I guess those characteristics, is there, and I guess I'll put it to David first. I mean, is there a right or a wrong project for this model, you think? Or you know, at Infrastructure BC, how are you guys selecting which project to apply this model to?
Yeah, so I think there's two categories in thinking about it, and one is any project that would lend itself to a fixed price contract. So whether it's a P3 or a design build, that you do your work in procurement and you think the best value is to have a team design and construct it, and that's going to get the most cost-effective risk transfer. And then, as I mentioned before, if the market conditions are such that there's not a big enough response, and then you look to a progressive approach to make the project more attractive, say. And then the other one would be if you are in a situation like Kate was describing, where the scope is unknown. So if it's like an emergency situation, or it's just so big and so complex that you're going to need to partner to figure out, that would be, I think, the second category of project, and you'd want to look at an iterative approach through progressive or through alliancing to set up a structure, so you're working with the contractor to solve those issues. But I think in the absence of sort of urgency or big unknowns, I think it's really going to end up being market driven.
Can I add one topic to that list, or one item to that list? And I think it would be where there's an opportunity to use new technology. And in many of those cases, the technologies are proprietary and may not even be well enough known to be scoped in a traditional contract. So I certainly think smart highways may fall into that category as we think ahead a little bit, where you have 5 or 6 different technologies being developed as to how to increase highway capacity by using tech. I think it would be very hard for the average highway department to sit down and write a full-fledged RFP for a smart highway without having the ability to really sit with individual technology providers. That does, however, open a new can of worms, if you will. And I'd love to kind of engage the panel on this, Terry, if I can hijack him for a second, which is it okay in a progressive procurement to actually compare apples to kumquats, or do we always have to get it down to a basket of apples and we're going to price only the apples? Because I think when you start thinking about the challenges of bringing all of our infrastructure into the 21st century, we do see that there are alternate solutions that deserve to be looked at side by side. And I wonder if this procurement methodology gives us a tool to do that with.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an excellent point. I mean, I think there's a lot of flexibility in different ways to structure this procurement model. I think, for example, like when you talk in technology, the first thing I think of is forget about new technology. Think about a P3 LRT project where you've got technology is a big part of it, and so maybe the owner, when they start the procurement, they're not sure. Hey, do I want monorail? Do I want APM? Well, whatever. And rather than scoping that out and locking that in, maybe they're further ahead to run an iterative process where whoever they select through that initial period is don't show up with a technology provider, because we're going to work with, the owner wants to work with the developer, design builder, whoever they want to select, and to do that pre-development feed stage, and then work together to pick the right solution, because then they can sort of see, hey, what's the cost impact to different structures, different technologies, pros and cons, work through that together. And also, when you think of technology, I think the other thing, Laurie, like, it might be limited technology providers. So for Smart Highway, maybe there's only one provider, so you couldn't even have them on 3 teams. So yeah, I think the model would be great for those and for those LRT type projects too. I don't know, Kate, what do you think?
Yeah, I really agree with what you just said there, Terry. I think in my experience, what I've noticed is there's a lot of pressure with P3s to get the right result for the right price. And sometimes that comes at the expense of innovation. And then if you look at collaborative contracting, you're almost measured on the amount of innovation that you've adopted in the project. So you can just see there's that polarized view on innovation and change, and instilling change in your project. And often the model that you pick doesn't give you the flexibility to adapt and buy that change. So I think from my perspective, if you want to get that innovation and get that change and get moving in that technological direction, collaborative models have a lot to offer in that space compared to that low cost base driver that P3 sometimes attracts.
Yeah, good point. So more focus on innovation and not just innovation on cost, right? Like it's getting the best value solution.
That's right. And often in collaborative contracting, I mean, even here in the alliance that we're on now, they're the mottos. It's best for project, value for money, and the owner's sitting there with you as a participant in that decision making. So if we go to the example that you put earlier about having that competitive space, you're doing that competition within yourselves, and you're really trying to select what the best value for money is, and it's all very open, transparent. You can see what you're getting for your money.
Right. And you mentioned value for money. I'm looking at some of the questions we're getting from the audience here. Maybe I'll go to one of the questions here, which is an interesting point. Is for value for money analysis is an important part of procurement options analysis and selecting procurements, like what's the right process. So I guess to you, David, I mean, how are these progressive models? How are you demonstrating the value for money analysis? Is it more a qualitative or a quantitative, or is it a bit of both that kind of gets you to to do the value for money analysis and picks a progressive model, whether it's alliance or other over other contracting models?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and I think in our experience, because the work that we've done under the progressive approach has been out of necessity, it's basically been, if you don't do it this way, there's no procurement. So it's a pretty easy decision to make. So it's the next step away from, like in our case, a typical design build is to do a progressive design build in order to get it done and end up with a design build contract that people generally understand the risk allocations and what the cost implications are. So it's more of a reaction. So I think where a project comes along where we're looking at scope that's complex, or I think to the point about technology is a really good one, that the analysis to say, well, is it going to be better value to look at a collaborative approach versus a traditional approach is going to be an interesting exercise that we haven't really been tested on that hard up until this point. I think one of the things, looking ahead to that kind of an analysis is around, things like schedule and cost with technology in particular, and it's a much broader topic, because the thing with technology is just that the pace of change is so rapid now that if you're into like an 18-month or a 2-year process, or you're spending, say, a year to 18 months analyzing procurement and a year to 18 months actually in procurement, and you're in an open collaborative process, you could sort of imagine that every 6 months there would be some sort of new type of technology or variation. And I think it would be interesting to understand, how do you balance sort of pure innovation and looking at all these different opportunities with actually getting something done by a certain time within a bracketed budget. So I think that would have to be part of the analysis as well in looking what the value is, but that's something that we're looking forward to.
I mean, I think that's an excellent point. Like, I mean, it really begs the question, like, how much does, the owner define that scope, specs, all those things before you start the procurement? Like, that party is going to vary. I mean, quite a bit. So I'm not sure, Laura, if you have some thoughts on that, like how much should be done?
I think in an ideal world, which we don't live in, as we all know, what the owner would do would be to succinctly and sharply define the problem they're trying to solve and allow the process to come up with the solution. I think the more you start with specs, the less likely you are to innovate, and the less likely you are to take advantage of changes in the marketplace that you may not be aware of, especially given the amount of time it takes to put specs together. The problem, of course, is the way the project development cycle works. We tend to focus not on the problems, but on the assets. We tend to talk about creating assets. So I remember a debate with Infrastructure Ontario when they were first starting to think about RER and the whole question of how do you add train capacity? Well, there's 2 ways to do it. One is to add tracks and trains, and the other is to change the way you schedule service and invest in signaling and dispatch and things like that. It's impossible to think about a public agency today who yet has the ability to scope a project that openly, to say, we just want to move 1 million people a week, tell us how we can best do it. But boy, that would be exciting, because I think that's where you would really, Kate's getting all excited here about all the new things she can think about. But that would really open the door to innovation. The problem then becomes, though, is, and I can go on, but I'll try to kind of be succinct on this. There are all these issues about proprietary knowledge and who owns what idea. And you've got to really scope the progressive procurement process in such a way that the private sector partners are willing to share information with the public agency, but protect that information from their competitors. And that's where it gets extraordinarily difficult, because in the best of all worlds, right, you would be able to pick an idea, part of the design from one provider and part of the technology from another, and put it all together and have everyone bid on it. But that doesn't happen because of all the protectedness that's put around intellectual property. I think that the downside of progressive procurement is going to be an awful lot of work for lawyers if we're not really careful. And God knows they've taken enough money on doing P3s. Sorry, all my friends who are lawyers, but I think one of the reasons we're all anxious about progressive procurement is it actually takes it out of the legal sphere and puts it back in the hands of the project owners and designers and operators. And we've got to be careful not to tip it too far back in the legal sphere.
Yeah, and you know, it's an interesting point about kind of like a couple things there I'd like to kind of touch on is, you know, like you say, it sounds like it's going to be quite a heavy lift, or these projects are quite a heavy lift from the owner's perspective, right? So it kind of starts to get to the question, like, I talked a bit about the process for these progressive models, short RF, you know, typical RFQ, let's call it, short RFP, and then you go into that pre-development phase, and it really begs the question, like, how many teams do you know, is the right number of teams to go into that pre-development phase? And like from a bidder's perspective, hey, our concern is, you know, it's a lot of resources from our side. We know it's a lot of resources from the owner's side. How do we know, because it's so collaborative, if there's multiple bidders, that ideas aren't, you know, inadvertently being shared? And so I don't know, Kate, what's been your experience with, like, is there a right number from what all the projects you've worked on to kind of go into that, call it, you know, development phase before execution?
Yeah, it's an interesting thought, and we've talked about this before, and I walked away from that conversation and had a bit of a think about it. I don't know that there is. I think it's very dependent on the type of work that you're actually delivering. In Australia, with the collaborative models, because there was so much concern from the owner's side about that competitive nature and have we got the right configuration and combination of people, they actually have developed a competitive collaborative model whereby two proponents go through. So two proponents do the behavioural assessment, two proponents do a development phase. And that's in order to get that competitive edge. Now, having said that, I don't know that the means to the ends was actually satisfied, because you then get industry all upset if they don't go through. So sometimes it's better to come third, not second. So there is that whole problem there about how do you make sure you're not making industry on the back foot and them losing that will to want to bid, but still creating that competitive tension. So I don't know that there's a sweet spot yet. Certainly, if there is one, I don't know that Australia has found it. Perhaps other countries have. I think there's still a bit of learning that needs to go on there. One thing I just also wanted to touch on while Laurie and David were speaking was I don't want anybody to be under any illusion that there's not a role for the owner in any of these model types. There's definitely a role. In fact, probably more of a role in a collaborative situation than a P3. So certainly these progressive models, as they're called a little bit more frequently here, isn't trying to negate the responsibility or the capacity of the owner to be part of that. In fact, we want the owner to be more of a participant, if anything, so that we really can get that sweet spot of how do you get that right competitive tension and that right solution. Yeah.
And so David, what are your thoughts on that? Kind of, I mean, you guys are doing, you know, alliance. You've got at least one alliance project going on. You've done some progressive. You use it. I know they are a fair bit of extra lift from the owner side. I think, as I understand. I mean, is there a right number? Like, is it a lot more work to manage say 3 bidders, 2 bidders, 1 bidders? Like, if you guys got a view on what's the right number?
Yeah, so I think the so we talked about a couple of things. So where we started was around the proposals and just the proponents having confidence in the process that, you know, ideas or approaches aren't inadvertently being shared. So I think that applies to whether it's a traditional P3, DB, progressive. If you've got 3 proponents under those more traditional models, and you've got one owner's team, and you're going back and forth, at the end of the day, the market's got to have confidence in the procuring body, and that's something that we certainly work really hard on to make sure that the market has that, so that they're excited about participating. And then, so that would carry forward into the progressive models and the alliance models, where you would have more than one team after the RFQ stage. So the progressive models that we've been doing here have had one team, and I think, again, in a perfect world, you would, if you were to set it up, not because, you know, you were trying to get someone to participate, but you were doing it for whatever reason, that you'd want to have probably 2. I think because in the case of a progressive design build or progressive P3 as one example, it's just more work and more time involved in the process, and it's just it's exponential. You know, if you add a third, it's not linear, I think, in terms of the time and effort involved and the owner resources. But there's definitely a role for the owner to be actively participating in that iterative process along the way, but it just maintains the competitive element that, you know, that's kind of where the magic happens in terms of design and innovation and you know, keeping people on schedule as well. And then I think with the alliance, going with 2 as well seems to be the right number for the same reason, I think. But under the alliance, my sense is that the owner is even more engaged, because, you know, they're going to go through into the implementation stage with a lot of the same people as part of the alliance team, and you're going to have to be ready to hit the ground running as part of a functioning implementation team. So I think the onus on the owner is potentially even greater in that respect. And I think similarly, you want to have the same owners team, I guess from my perspective, involved with both of the proponents, so that it is kind of apples to apples. So, you know, hypothetically, if you set it up that there were 2 owners teams, one with each proponent, to try to somehow keep it separate, it might get confusing and problematic where it came time to evaluate it and make a decision. So I'd say one owners team definitely involved, and, you know, 2 proponents might be the magic number.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just speak from the developer contractor perspective. These are very resource intense, and like you said, David, to make them attractive to bidders. I mean, you know, knowing it's going to be down to 2 and knowing the resources that are expected from the owner, I think that 2 or 1 in our perspective is kind of where you know, we'd like to see them going. We think 3 is probably too much for an owner to manage, and also it starts to look like a lot of resources from everyone chasing the same project. So I guess I'm just looking at some of the questions off on the side here. I think you know, an interesting question about alliance delivery over progressive P3, and I guess that when I look at that question, I kind of think of collaborative models, and alliance is one of the collaborative models. But I know, Kate, you've got a lot of experience with alliance. And I guess the question I always think is, like, when should you make the decision on the contract model if it's going to be alliance? And I think alliance could, you know, ultimately be a P3 also. Do you think that because we have seen other projects, I know that the Kiewit's been involved in, where it was a progressive model and the decision was made on whether it was going to go alliance or design build was actually made as part of the development phase. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, we've done that that type of thing before too here in Australia. Here in Australia, sorry, I don't even know where I am.
Should be in Australia.
Yeah, that's right, exactly. One model that we use, which is very much about that, is called delivery partner, and that was a very successful model that was to deliver the Pacific Highway from Wagulga to Ballina on the New South Wales Central Coast. And what that did was it was almost like a bit of a program manager, actually, whereby we helped the owner decide what the procurement models would be for the packaging up of the different projects they wanted to get underway. I guess going to the fundamental question about when is the right time, I'm still thinking about Laurie's position before, where she said, wouldn't it be great if you had a blank sheet of paper and you just said, hey, industry, let's work on this together. I mean, that just makes me so excited. I can't tell you, but I think it really needs to be at the start. I think it really needs to be at that inception phase. You almost have to have an idea in your head about how you're going to do the scope, and then that will define what that model is going to be. I think you can get into a very tangled spiral if you go down a particular path and you pursue that path because you're headstrong about it, rather than opening up to the flexibility of the different paths along the way and looking at them at the start and then developing down those lines.
Oh, thanks. So I guess Laurie or David, anything to add on top of that in terms of picking the right between the different models? Or
I think, yeah, maybe just quickly, I was thinking as Kate was talking that, from an owner's perspective or from a government perspective, that at the outset the owner's trying to solve a problem and providing services, and then the next step is how do you procure it, and to just really go in with eyes open and be really objective about asking yourself, why are we doing this model? Why are we doing progressive? Why are we doing alliance? Is it something we don't know? Is it so risky we can't even price it? Do we need innovation and technology that the private sector can bring that we don't even know about? But to really be clear and thoughtful about why you're going down that path, because it is critical that they align in order to get the right outcome.
And I think I might add that at least as I look at the world from a financing point of view and as a owner's risk point of view and a surety perspective, whatever gets us to the place should result in a fairly standard form construction agreement. I mean, I think we're not talking about, I don't think we are talking about, I should qualify that, but we're not talking about upending the traditional roles and responsibilities of construction in the field. I think what we're talking about is how do we get to a place where we agree on what we're going to build and how we're going to build it. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind, because if we start monkeying with this process too much, we are going to find ourselves in a situation where banks aren't going to lend money, sureties aren't going to put up bonds, unions aren't going to know how to, develop project agreements. So it's a bit like a funnel, right? But ultimately, what you come out at the end with is a really standard form, tried and true construction agreement. And I'm not sure if any of the other panelists disagree with me, but that's certainly how I see it.
Yeah, I mean, if I could add to that, I mean, I agree. You're gonna, and maybe that actually gets to one of the questions here, which is about the influence of equity investors and developers. Like I think this is an evolution of the model. We're not talking, and really it's the approach to the model. So I mean, I think you're going to still end up with, you still need to end up with a P3 contract that you can finance, that like you say, all the different parties are comfortable with. They know their roles. They're allocating risks and responsibilities to the right party. So I mean, I would agree. I mean, you still have to end up with a financeable deal. So all the parties you'd expect to see in a normal P3 will still be involved here and have roles in developing. And the difference is you're going to have if it's progressive DBE versus progressive P3, P3, you're going to have the equity developers and operators involved, so you get like the whole life perspective and the benefits of financing, all those things in a P3. So it's the evolution of the model, and sort of and I think you end up with a better risk allocation. So maybe the conversation is how you develop the commercial terms in the contract, and that it helps with all those things. So I'm watching. The rest of the audience can't see. I've got a big clock in front of me that's counting down, and I'm just about out of time. So I wanted to take the last few seconds just to thank the panelists for participating. It's been a great conversation. I've really enjoyed it. I hope everyone in the audience has as well. I don't know if there's like a last. We're almost out of time, but I don't know if there's anyone on the panel who had anything else to add that I've missed, or but you got 15 seconds.
Just thanks for moderating, Terry. Good job.
Thank you. Okay, thank you everyone, and hope you enjoyed the panel as much as I enjoyed moderating it. Thanks.